MSW Media.
Hi, I'm Harry Littman, host of Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent figures from government law and journalism for a dynamic discussion of the most important topics of the day. Each Monday, I'm joined by a slate of Feds favorites and new voices to break down the headlines and give the insider's view of what's going on in Washington and beyond. Plus sidebars explaining important legal concepts read by your favorite celebrities. Find Talking Feds wherever you get your podcasts.
The rule of law is not just some lawyer's turn of phrase. It is the very foundation of our democracy. The essence of the rule of law is that like cases are treated alike. That there not be one rule for Democrats and another for Republicans, one rule for the powerful, another for the powerless, one rule for the rich and another for the poor, or different rules depending upon one's race or ethnicity. To serve as Attorney General at this critical time is a calling I am honored and eager to answer.
So now it's clean up on aisle 45 time. And for a long while yet, it is going to be clean up on aisle 45.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Clean Up on Aisle 45. This is episode 90. It's Wednesday, October 5th. And joining me today, because Andrew is in Italy, having a wonderful time on his vacation, is Pete Strzok. Hey, Pete, how are you?
I'm good. I, like you, am not in Italy, but we will make do with Northern Virginia and Southern California, which is almost like Italy in its own way, in their own way.
Yeah, I think if you combine them, it's still probably nothing like Italy, but...
but no, not at all.
but here we are. I appreciate you holding down the fort with me this week. And the reason I wanted to bring you in is because you are an expert in counterintelligence and espionage. And by the way, another person named Anna, who from Russia was arrested last week on espionage charges. I don't know what it is with Annas, but I think you have a little bit of experience with the Russian spies named Anna. So I thought that was an interesting little tidbit.
Yeah, last week was busy. There was a lot going on. There was the couple. There was also some announcements made about some old Chinese economic espionage cases. I think somebody was sentenced or is due to be sentenced. And then, of course, there was the third thing, which I'm probably forgetting, which is also a...
Oleg Deripaska.
Yeah, well, Deripaska for sure. And in addition to Deripaska, I want to say there was somebody else who was arrested talking to an FBI agent he believed to be a foreign intelligence officer, in addition to the couple. But my mind is suddenly drawing a blank. But there was a lot going on.
Yeah, a lot in espionage, which I thought was really interesting timing. I don't know, somebody woke up the espionage monster, and now all of a sudden we've got all these cases going on. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, because we've been following very closely here on Clean Up on Aisle 45, the whole Mar-a-Lago document debacle. And we saw that recently the Department of Justice put forward a pretty succinct motion for an expedited briefing schedule to the 11th Circuit for their full appeal. And their what they're sort of putting forth here is look, we really needed to have that stay lifted on the classified documents because of national security risks and that being inextricably linked to a criminal investigation. But also, these other 11,000 documents are still very important to our criminal investigation, and we're the executive branch, and that is one of the important jobs of the executive is criminal investigations, and those usually outweigh any privilege claims. And so we're going to appeal the entire thing, which they put a notice to appeal the entire Cannon's entire thing earlier on, but they really wanted to get the classified document stuff settled, which they did. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit first about why. Well, let's talk about why the non-classified documents, because Brandon Van Grack, former colleague on the Mueller investigation, and then ended up heading up the FARA unit briefly, at the Department of Justice, now back in private practice, said, look, AG, it's not irrelevant. These non-classified documents aren't irrelevant to the investigation. And because they, the fact that they were commingled with these classified documents is important to the criminal investigation, which is an executive branch function and can often outweigh privilege claims. So you've handled this kind of investigation before. Can you talk a little bit about why the non-classified documents being commingled with the classified documents, particularly like in his office or in his desk drawers, need to be criminally investigated for things like 2071 concealment, obstruction, and 793 espionage?
Sure. So there are a lot of reasons. I mean, the easiest way to maybe talk about this is to start at a very granular level and talk about the investigative reasons. DOJ would and the FBI would want access potentially to all those documents. And then I think there's a broader strategic long-term decision that's going on here. And we can talk about that at the end. But, as you said, as Brandon said, there is, whether or not, it is particularly interesting because they're commingled, but even if they weren't, it's important to remember that there are 3 charges listed. In one was dealing with classified information, 2 were not. One was dealing with obstruction, the other was, illegally essentially maintaining a record that he wasn't entitled to have. But those 2 things, those latter 2 criminal charges, have nothing to do with classified information one way or the other. And what is important, the classified documents, presumably, except for maybe the ones where he may have written something on it, those aren't his thoughts, those aren't his writing, those don't speak to his state of mind. All those are something that the U.S. intelligence community or U.S. government has produced that's classified that he had. What's interesting, though, and we don't know what's in the unclassified material, but I'll lay out a bunch of potential hypotheticals, which hopefully will illustrate to your listener why those might be really relevant to investigators. Say in that batch of unclassified material, there's a folder that's labeled material to give to Rudy to give to Derkach. Right? That would indicate that, something that would give an idea why Trump was holding on to those classified documents. It's one thing to sit there and say, well, these documents exist in the abstract, but we have yet to hear, we've heard no explanation from Trump, no explanation from his attorneys why on earth he wanted to keep it. But if he had it in the context of files having to do with Rudy, or files having to do with MBS or Saudi Arabia, or files having to do with something for a business deal in a golf course that he wants to open, or a new Trump property somewhere in Azerbaijan, it might give you an idea of the context of why he was holding on to those documents. The other thing, independent of the documents themselves, perhaps there are communications between him and his attorneys, between him and his staff saying, on the one hand, don't tell the government that I have these documents. Feel free to let the government in the storage room, but please don't tell them about anything that's in my office. Things to his attorney saying, just do what you have to do to get them out of my hair. Tell them I don't have any. I haven't really looked, but tell them that I have. There are any number of communications that he might have had either with his attorneys or non-attorneys that would speak to his knowledge of, things like, hey, of course I never declassified these. They're still classified, but I'm going to say that I did declassify them. Or gosh, I might be in trouble. I didn't know that I should have declassified them. What can I do now? There are any number of things in there that, while unclassified, would be very, very relevant in terms of understanding his state of mind about what he knew, what he didn't know, why he was trying to conceal, whether he was trying to encourage others to conceal or obstruct the FBI's investigation. And even if some of these were with his attorneys, there's something called a crime fraud exception that you don't get to sit there and say, anything I say to my attorneys, no matter what, is privileged and you can't ever see it. If you're engaged in a criminal act with your attorney, there's something called a crime fraud exception where the government, meeting a certain threshold of proof, can get that information, and essentially that pierces privilege, that they can use it. So all these things go to very important elements of each of the crimes that if you're going to prove that in a court of law, you're going to have to prove some of these things separate and distinct from just, oh, this document was appropriately classified. So all those are examples. I think there's a broader issue here. And I think DOJ started very narrowly with just wanting the classified documents back, saw that Deary, the special master, was, moving ahead with a very reasonable, not rapid, but a very sort of deliberate, meaningful pace to get this out of the way. And then Cannon steps in and undoes all this and throws all kinds of sand in the gears and pushes the schedule way into the next year. And I think DOJ looked at that and said, okay, this is too much. This is not something not only in this case, we don't want precedent set. We don't want every single high level, any defendant sitting there saying, I want a special master, I want to delay this for months and months and months. And that this judge, in my opinion, clearly abusing her discretion, clearly well outside of her role of a U.S. District Court judge, is doing something that DOJ wants to send a clear message through appeal. This isn't something acceptable. So I think there's also a broader strategic thing going on as well. And that's why I don't know that DOJ envisioned this expedited appeal until Cannon sort of mucked around with Deary's process and flow. And it was only after that you saw the government step in and file this appeal.
Yeah, well, I mean, she even went back on her original briefing schedule, which was supposed to be finished by, I think in her initial order, November 30th. But then again, when the amended plan came out, she pushed it back to December 16th. And yeah, with the broader appeal here, they're really going to go after jurisdiction here. They're going to argue that there was no equitable jurisdiction because, as they say, you cannot have equitable jurisdiction over inequitable behavior or acts. And that's when I use the whole example of that, that we've all seen on America's Dumbest Criminals or Cops or whatever, where the lady tries to do a crack deal with a guy and he rips her off. And so she flags down some police officers and says, hey, help me get my money back. And that's inequitable behavior. And you can't, I'm sorry, we can't help enforce a law that you broke. Now, with regards to the lawyers and the crime fraud exception, I think what's interesting here, and Carol Lenig and Dawsey and the rest put out in the Washington Post that she's lawyered up. We knew that, but that she's also willing to cooperate with the Department of Justice. And what's interesting about Christina Bobb is she was also in the Willard on January 5th, and she was on a phone call to try to coordinate the fraudulent electors. So she's got her hands in a lot of stuff. But the thing about the crime fraud exception with her is that she went on television and said she was not a lawyer in the documents case. She was just a documents custodian. So she openly obliterated an attorney-client relationship with Donald Trump and will not be able to claim at all attorney-client privilege, though she might try some executive privilege stuff. Does the crime fraud exception apply to executive privilege?
I don't know. That's a good question. I can't imagine it would. That seems to be the whole my understanding of the theory and the intent underneath crime fraud piercing any sort of privilege, that it would apply to executive privilege in a similar way that it would to attorney-client privilege. But I'm not the right person to ask about that. But I mean, it seems to me Nixon couldn't sit there and claim executive privilege over the Watergate tapes, that were evidence of the break-in and of other crimes.
Yeah, but I think in that case, the decision was based on the fact that the criminal investigation took precedent over an executive privilege claim, which is kind of a sort of backdoor around into crime fraud exception, because we're criminally investigating something. But, we'll see. Have you ever had a case where somebody wrote personal notes on a classified document and therefore magically made it a personal document?
No, because I think this is what makes this so unique, right? I mean, this is what there are privileges that attach to the executive, to the president, that don't exist with, if you're secretary of some department in the U.S. or some high-ranking, CIA director or something like that. You don't have that same sort of executive privilege claim.
But then they would become presidential records, wouldn't they? Which are still
right.
Yeah.
They're still right. And so some of it is, he can't, except for Judge Cannon keeps giving him his cake and letting him eat it too. You can't sit there and say on the one hand that, these are my notes and therefore there's an executive privilege in there, because then they do become, I think by all accounts, a presidential record. So it's not. It isn't something, if he had taken a document and wrote a note to Patsy Baloney saying, hey, what do you think about this, this, and this, and then sent it to the White House counsel's office, there's no indication anything like that exists. That would be the closest thing I could sit there and say, okay, well, maybe that's some sort of, in addition to just presidential privilege, there's some sort of potentially, attorney sort of counsel and deliberative privilege in there. But I'm not the right person to sort of unpack whether or not any sort of presidential privilege, executive privilege could be pierced by a crime fraud exception.
Yeah. And there's just so many novel concepts going on with this case because we're talking about a former president who was stealing and concealing and lying about having documents. We've really never had anything like this because, as the DOJ argued, even if these are just presidential records, you do get access to them, but you do not have possessory ownership of them. And you also can't lie about, it's just, everything that seems so obvious and clear to us, he has this way of coming in and sort of mucking it up, flooding the zone with shit, as it were, per, Steve Bannon, to kind of confuse the issue. And he gets into these legal weeds that make no sense, that confuse people, and when we should just be looking at the big picture. Like, you took them, you lied about having them, you didn't say they were declassified right when you handed a Redwell double-wrapped envelope over. That's not how you treat declassified documents. So, I'm wondering if he's saying, well, those are the ones I didn't declassify, and I handed them over. All the rest I I don't know what his, all he can do is delay.
It's all in bad faith. It's all in bad faith. There's nothing there that is like a legitimate reason that he's given. It is all a lie. It is all, I think, a means to, he got caught doing something he shouldn't have done, and he's trying to weasel out of it. Then it's like, everything else he tends to do, he just mucks around. And it's like if you try and listen to or watch some of these PowerPoint presentations that Mike Lindell gives about how the vote was stolen, it's all argle-margle. None of it doesn't make sense. And if you try and okay, let me try and follow along what he's saying, it makes no sense. It is just this incoherent rambling of word salad that has no basis in law, has no basis really in fact, but because he's like, well, he's the former president, this is what he's trying to explain himself, you try and follow along, and it's all bullshit. It really is. And all these filings create this overlay of, both sort of legal propriety because they're legal words, and because they're legal words, they also can get confusing to a non-attorney. So it has that double effect of I don't really understand it, and it's a lawyer saying it, so it probably might be more credible than something coming out of Trump's mouth. So, but it's all designed to obscure the truth, and that's that he took the shit that he shouldn't have taken.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of what we learned in the seditious conspiracy Oath Keepers trial this morning. Their defense, well, we learned it a little bit earlier with their pretrial filings, but they're saying, hey, everything we did was legal. We stashed our weapons in Virginia. We didn't bring them in to D.C. We were waiting for Donald to use the Insurrection Act to call us up as a militia, and we are a legit militia under the law or the Constitution. And so everything we did was legal, and therefore we can't be possibly guilty of seditious conspiracy. And I feel like that's using deceptive legal language to argue something that's blatantly obvious. The Department of Justice has brought 5 seditious conspiracy cases in the last 80 years. They've won one of them or 2 of them maybe. They rarely bring this charge. This is Merrick Garland is not he's an institutionalist, and I bet it took him a minute. When Mike Sherwin wanted to bring seditious conspiracy against the Oath Keepers, Garland was like, no, he turned him down. But when, the new U.S. attorney got in there and got the evidence and got the right stuff together, came back after Sherwin went on 60 Minutes and said, we're thinking about seditious conspiracy charges, almost blew the whole case. The new U.S. attorney in D.C. buttoned it up and brought it back to Garland and said, look, this is unequivocally seditious conspiracy. And Garland I'm sure Garland had to okay that. And I just don't see in any world that he would if they didn't think they had an airtight case here.
I hope so. I think that's right. I think, there's no telling where a jury ultimately is going to land. I think the goal of the prosecution will be to say, it's not that complicated. Look at what they did. Look at the video of what happened, and just believe your eyes and believe the evidence. When the defense is going to try and muddle it all up with, the Insurrection Act, which I don't know how that necessarily would give the Oath Keepers or anybody else authority to bring, guns and weapons into DC. But, they're going to try and throw everything out there to try and at if they can confuse one juror enough to sit there and say, well, I don't know, then you've got, you either deadlock the jury and you get a mistrial, or they're acquitted. So they just need to get a juror to, buy into whatever crazy nonsense. And it will be, it's like, again, all these folks, it's like arguing with sovereign citizens. And, they've got these false writs, and they're going to do, we're going to put a lien on your house, and they're going to effect a citizen's arrest. And it's all this, like, it's this made up universe that, collides into the real justice system. And I hope, like has happened so many times, that when this kind of land of make-believe law, the pony unicorn law of Magaland hits the reality of the U.S. justice system, that it has so many times, it just kind of crumbles because it's all made up. There's no factual, logical basis for it. And, thank God those sorts of things have not survived in our justice system.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note, too, that the Oath Keepers are on the hook for multiple other charges, including obstructing an official proceeding, which has been won in jury trials 100% of the time when it's brought. They've got a lot of guilty pleas. They've secured a lot of guilty pleas on that. It carries the same max sentence as seditious conspiracy. So we could see a thing where a jury might be like, well, they did, maybe not seditious conspiracy, but these other charges, juries can do that. They don't have to say all or none. So we will see what happens in that trial. It's expected to last 3 to 4 weeks. But back to the Cannon thing. Audio tapes were released today from Maggie Haberman, who's had them for a year and a half, of Donald Trump admitting on tape that he took, for example, he said, the Kim Jong-un letters and kept them at Mar-a-Lago. That's a crime. And we have him on tape admitting to it. And if that letter, now here's my question, that's a non-classified thing. If that non-classified document was commingled with classified documents, and he admitted to having and taking the Kim Jong-un letter, does that sort of give credence to him taking the classified documents as well? I mean, is that kind of why these non-classified documents are so important?
Sure, that's one of the reasons. Sure. I mean, one of the reasons is absolutely, there are just so many, I can sit here and come up with dozens of hypotheticals, and that certainly is one of them, right? That if he is admitting to saying, I kept these things for this reason, and then, whatever, there was like some leather-bound volume. I've seen some reporting that was in the office that seemed to be, it's like his little, holy of holies, but, whatever was in there. If there were some documents where he said clearly, yes, I'm keeping these 17 things because, they're all important in some way. And of those 17, 5 are classified, 12 are unclassified, and those 12 speak to why he was keeping it. It conveys sort of knowledge and selection and reasons for why he'd want to keep it. So yes, for sure, that's one of those reasons. And, the flip side is, conceivably there could be an instance where, whatever that day's events where he was just shoving shit in a box and there was no rhyme or reason to it, it might be a little bit mitigating, saying, well, look, I didn't really select any of this. This was just, the documents from June 15th of 2019, and I just shoved it all in the box without really paying attention to what was in there. So it could cut both ways. I think the likelihood that are things that are inculpatory, things that are very relevant to the investigation, I'm almost certain there are multiple examples of that in the unclassified material. But yes, for sure that, things he has said about the unclassified stuff is going to inform his state of mind about the classified stuff that he was keeping as well.
Now, what about the DOJ, as instructed, did their homework and put together a more detailed inventory of what they took on August 8th. And it matches pretty well with their first inventory. A couple of changes. But I noticed in both inventories, there's a couple of folders that say return to military liaison or return to Pentagon or return to something so-and-so. What are those? Do some classified documents come in folders with instructions on them like that to make sure the chain of custody is followed? I don't think I've ever heard of any kind of a direction on a folder like that.
Yeah, I think that depends on the administration and how they route information into and out of the Oval Office or up to the residence. And I can envision a scenario where he was, in addition to the PDB, if he had some sort of read folder that somebody from the Situation Room, that they might use a military officer, an aide to attaché to bring him material and to bring it back. But that's something you'd probably have to speak to somebody who's in sort of the admin side of the White House operations to give you a rundown of like what that was and how they managed that flow. But I think
wondering too if they like put those instructions on there, because he famously just kept shit and didn't follow directions.
That's a question I haven't heard really asked by anybody in a position to ask it, and maybe one of the intel committees will do it. But like at some point early on, everybody in the White House knew that Trump was a record-keeping disaster, right? Early on, like from the I fired Comey, and he's sitting there telling Lavrov about a great, weight being lifted, and he's sharing allegedly, friendly foreign allied classified information with him early in the presidency. Like within days of the beginning of the presidency, people understood this guy was a classified information handling disaster, right? Everybody knew it. And so why did not somebody, way before we ever get to Mark Meadows, when we have quote unquote, reasonable, competent chiefs of staff, Reince Priebus and Kelly and whoever else was in the role, why did not somebody or somebody on the intelligence community side of things say, hey, look, we need a very rigorous classified document flow management process, right? So that before anything touches Trump, we have a very detailed list of what is given to him. And then when it comes out, we line it up and check off what either we got back or what we didn't get back. Now, we're not going to be able to go to the man and say, hey, sir, look, you left these 5 things out. We want them. But at a minimum, there would be some fucking record out there that would sit there and say, here is the body of material that was given to Trump and not given back. Why? Who? Because all of these people carrying it in all have a history of handling extraordinarily sensitive classified information. All of them have signed all the non-disclosure agreements. All of them have taken polygraphs. All of them have been sworn for the very sensitive stuff, gone through all kinds of extra hoops. All of them know how sensitive it is. And every single time, now apparently hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, based on what's been seized, stuff never came out that went in. Didn't anybody say, hey, we need to start keeping a log of this?
Well, I think we have some burrowed employees. Patel, for example, at the Pentagon. He wanted to put Michael Ellis over in the NSA. I think he had people in these agencies that would bring him this stuff and not keep a record of where it went. Honestly, of course we're in speculation land now. But, and I also, that's why I asked, maybe this, return to Pentagon instructions were placed on some of these things that, and maybe they don't normally do that, but, they had to say, well, we need to remind him that he can't keep this, or that when he's done with it, it has to be returned. But why there wouldn't be a log, maybe there is. Maybe there are people in the intelligence community, career prosecutor, that know about this stuff, and there are logs and there are things missing, and that's how they knew things were missing. But they didn't really do anything at the Department of Justice until the National Archives stepped in and said, hey, we got these 15 boxes back, and there were classified documents in it. That shouldn't have been a surprise, but it seems like it was.
Right. Agreed.
Yeah. So that's frightening. Given, I've handled some top secret documents. You've handled tons. And you and I know the rigor that goes into reviewing, handling, guarding sometimes those documents, and keeping track of them. So it's very confusing to me as to why in May the National Archives came to the FBI and said, hey, we found these, and the FBI went, whoa, we didn't even realize they were gone. Like how did I don't understand how those kinds of things flew under the radar. I have a classified documents question for you. Are there safeguards in classified documents that prevent them from being copied or photographed? I've been wondering about this. Back in my day, no, you could copy anything, but I'm wondering if there's some new kind of, how banks have watermarks on checks and stuff. Is there something in place like that with super classified documents?
I think it depends on a lot of things. Yeah, and I don't want to get into too much discussion of it. I would say that, what happens in the White House is going to be very different from what happens in most intelligence community agencies. And so the issue would be whatever you do to track it, whether something's printed, how it's printed, controls that may or may not be obvious. I don't know what happens in the context of when it goes to the president. And so whatever things might exist, I think, are not going to potentially be as effective or available.
I see.
It's president.
A secret. Okay, that's fine. Because I was wondering about in the White House National Security Council, there's the NICE, the NICE system, where Michael Ellis, the lawyer, shoved the Zelensky transcript to keep fewer eyes on it, and there were almost half a dozen to a dozen Putin phone calls that might have ended up in there. I'm wondering about all that and who has access to that now, and if they're looking at it even, or if it's kind of like, let's just move forward. It just feels weird.
I don't. That's a good question. That was a thing that was interesting. Is like what sort of records? Did people go in at the end of the administration and destroy all that? Eisenberg and was on doing a lot of that movement and directing them to be placed in that system. Now there's a lot of really, really sensitive information that goes on that system, and the question would be everything from the transcript of the call with Zelensky, anything with Putin, all the the translator notes that Trump ordered that his translator turned over, all those things. Where did they go, and were they maintained or were they destroyed? Who did anybody go back and look at that from the perspective of setting aside he's the chief executive, however crazy he might view his role in the U.S. national security, just to look and see if there's any crime there. I don't know. And do they still exist?
Yeah, I feel like if I were in an intelligence agency, I would day one be like, all right, inventory of everything we know we're supposed to have now. Go now. But I have no idea how that works, and I don't know what it looks like. There's just so much that I feel like, and this is the government. I worked for the government for a very long time. We know how things can fall through the cracks and get lost, and I hate to think of that in these super classified this intelligence.
And the funny thing is, like, ironically, it might have gotten, like many other things, just overwhelmed by the kind of flow and course of events, and nobody has the time or resources to look back. But because you have this maintenance of classified information at Mar-a-Lago and potentially elsewhere, might cause people to then go in and start asking questions that otherwise might have got just kind of left in the dust of the past. But now, if somebody says, okay, well, we have an issue with records, so let's go into the NSC system and figure out if there are records in there and go through and take a closer look at it. Who knows? I mean, I would want to know that as an investigator, but I don't know where, the scope of what the investigation is or where they're looking or what NARA may or may not be doing in the context of asking for things to get turned over.
And I mean, within the government, there are audits we can run that can be referred to the Department of Justice if malfeasance is found. You don't have to open a full-on criminal investigation to find out if some stuff is missing. There's steps. We'll see what happens with all this. But back to this appeal, and what's interesting to me is that I think that the government was very reasonable. They said, we would like October 14th for us to file our full appeal. And then November 4th, we would like a response from Donald. And then November 11th, we'll reply. They really truncated their own reply times and only shaved, I think, 9 days off of Donald's. And then they said, as far as oral arguments, we'll let the court set the matter at its earliest convenience, whether that be the first available calendar after the end of the expedited briefing schedule or through a special sitting. But they didn't put a date on it. But then the Trump team comes back and says, what do you mean you're only going to give us 21 days? All right, you can have your till the 14th. We want our full 30 days, and then you can have another 7 days if you want. So that would be a November 20th. It would push it back 9 days because they want their full 30 days to reply, which, I think probably reasonably they could get just because that's the general rule is you have 30 days. But the DOJ has a very good argument that we need these sooner rather than later. And this is, our executive stuff. This is with regards to the non-classified documents. But then they argue, the Trump team argues, but we don't think oral argument should happen until next year, January. And that, right. Because, well, and you can feel the push and pull because Kais is actually on this has signed this, and he was sort of sidelined.
Yeah, and Trusty, just it's only those two, Kai's and Trusty. None of the other kind of weirdos.
But you could feel the Kai's parts, and you could feel the Trusty parts. Like in one footnote, and this is totally Trusty. We just want you to know we still think that the DOJ and the FBI are fucked up tricksters, and so please refer to what we think in our original reply to the motion for a stay or whatever back in the canon times. We just want to let you know we still feel that way. And Kai's was probably like, can we not say it all and spell it out? Can we just refer to our previous filing, so that we don't look like assholes here? But what was funny was the reason for January was, look, it'll be November 20th, and then you got Thanksgiving, and then December, where the government doesn't do any
does
work.
Anything in December, right?
So January's reasonable. We think that's reasonable, and
yeah, we just want to wait until the next Congress gets sworn in. Is what they want.
And exactly, and then Trusty comes back in, or what seems very Trusty-esque. And let me see if I can find the paragraph here. The government can't possibly be prejudiced if this appeal is not expedited and Trump is afforded a few extra days. Additionally, Trump respectfully requests oral arguments be completed with the rules of the court. And finally, and here's where Trusty, and I call it the Trusty Stank. He says, finally, the extraordinary circumstances herein presented, an investigation of the 45th president by the administration of his political rival, would countenance against any rush to judgment. Indeed, the public interest is served best by transparent, thorough consideration of all the issues. So he's actually saying the public interest is in favor of delay rather than getting these documents back for an investigation.
Give me a break. But the public interest, there's no, and they're hanging this all on this nonsense thing about, it's the president, the first time ever being, investigated by his rival. And it's so, there's no public interest in investigating crime.
Well, and that hints at malfeasance. That hints at like, it's a political hit job, which it is not. And that drives me bananas.
Right. Yeah. I was looking, yes, I agree. It's hard to.
You could say fuck on this show. Pete.
Yeah, no, I know. I've already sworn. I need to modulate the frequency of it so it's more effective. It's more impactful.
I see. Right. So yeah.
Yeah. So I can't imagine that the circuit would let this lay until that long.
There's 3 perfectly good working weeks in December to have a 1 or 2 day oral argument.
And we're in the beginning of October, so that's 2 months away from that. So yeah, I think we'll see something before then, and I anticipate could even see something in that last week of November, that week before Thanksgiving, which is at the end of November. Feasibly, if they have an open calendar or do what the DOJ said, a special sitting. But I gotta say, reading the 11th Circuit's last decision, I don't think they're taking any shit from the Trump team on this, honestly. And these are two of these are Trump appointees, but they have the supreme executive thing in their head, these conservative courts, and I think that I'm happy at the way the DOJ has posed these arguments in that light. Do you know what I mean? They're really speaking to the 11th Circuit. Yeah, and they have to. I mean, it's written. There's a different way. It's interesting. You write. Haven't dealt much with appellate law. There have been a couple of cases that have moved up to the circuit court, and one that touched on the Supreme Court, but it's a very different way of writing, and you get different attorneys at DOJ. Like, you won't get typically AUSAs when it moves to the Circuit Court of Appeals, and certainly up to the Supreme Court. That's where you get, LC and the Office of Solicitor General writing it, and it is a very different way of writing. It's a very different argument. You're not arguing facts. You're arguing sort of concept of how the established facts apply to the law. So you don't get a lot of like argument about what happened. It's more argument about the way the law has been applied or not applied. So it's just a very different, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but as a non-lawyer reading it, you're like, wow, this is, what you said, you look at it and it's just a very it is a different flavor and feel for what you'd see in some district court argument.
Do you think the court will agree that the non-classified documents are just as important to the criminal investigation as the classified documents?
I don't even know that they'll say justice, or that they'll make it a relative judgment one way or the other. I think what they'd say is, whether or not that the executive has in the context of doing what the executive does, investigating crimes, that it is, I would imagine, that the district court overstepped in doing some of the, granting some of the relief that it did, and that it isn't appropriate given the separation of powers, that it is not within the district court's right to do what they did and throwing out a bunch of stuff. Now, again, whether that sort of like returns it to say you can't do any of this and, restart something or do something, I just, I don't know that it would, I don't know how this impacts the timing, but I do think it's pretty clear that what Cannon has done has greatly outstepped the role of the judiciary in Article 3 in the context of Article 2 powers.
Yeah, well,
so I would anticipate the circuit court to say something like that pretty strongly.
Yeah, the circuit court already hinted at the argument of jurisdiction. I think they might rule that she didn't have jurisdiction to have this case in the first place, might remand it back to the Reinhardt court, and Reinhardt would be like, we don't need a special master, and, end of story. We'll see. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, but I think that the jurisdictional argument is going to be key, because I concur with what the 11th Circuit hinted at and what the DOJ is asserting. Judge Cannon never had jurisdiction in the first place.
I don't know, again, it's a question better asked of an attorney, whether or not the circuit could throw out Cannon's jurisdiction altogether, or whether it reasonably could be filed in her district.
Yeah, well, Kais could come back and say, well, then we argue anomalous jurisdiction instead of equitable jurisdiction. And they say, all right, well, we have to start all over again and listen to that argument. I mean, who the hell knows how this will all go? Meanwhile, we've got the special master reviewing these documents. On what schedule yet? I don't know. If they go by Cannon's schedule, it'll be mid-December. So now it's kind of a race to see what gets done faster, the appeal and how it comes out, or the special master review. So I think that's kind of where we're at. Anyway.
Yep, I think that's
all right. Cool. Well, I appreciate you sitting in for Andrew today, my intrepid lawyer sunning himself in Italy and eating probably all sorts of delicious foods. We'll get there one day, Pete. We'll get there one day. We just got to keep working. We just got to keep working.
Right.
All right. Good. Well, I appreciate your time today. Everybody, we will be back with Cleanup on Aisle 45 next week. As you know, every Wednesday. I think Andrew might be out again. So, Pete, I might see if I can tap you to sit in and answer some more questions when we get more appeal information.
Sounds good.
All right, everybody. Until then, I've been Allison Gill and Pete Strzok. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Cleanup on Aisle 45 is written, researched, and produced by Allison Gill and Andrew Torrez, with editing by Molly Hockey. Our art and logo design are by Joelle Reeder and Moxie Design Studios, and our music is composed and performed by Adam Orr. Cleanup on Aisle 45 is a proud member of the MSW Media Network, a collection of creator-owned podcasts dedicated to news, politics, and justice. For more information, visit mswmedia.com.
They Might Be Giants have been on the road for too long. Too long. And They Might Be Giants aren't even sorry. Not even sorry. And audiences like the shows too much. Too much. And now They Might Be Giants are playing their breakthrough album, Flood. All of it. And they still have time for other songs. They're fooling around. Who can stop They Might Be Giants and their liberal rock agenda? Who? No one. This ad was paid for with somebody else's money.